Chapter 1. The Chipped Cup. The village of Little Wickham announced itself first by scent rather than sight, wood smoke and wet stone, and beneath that, faintly, the sweetness of late roses going over in the hedgerows. Miss Jane Marple, arriving by the 4:15 omnibus, with her small case and her smaller expectations, thought it a very pretty sort of place, the kind that photographed well for calendars, and concealed, as such places so often did, a great deal beneath its photogenic surface. She had come only for the church fete, a favour to a second cousin who organised the flower stall and had written 3 times to say the Michaelmas daisies would want a knowledgeable eye. Miss Marple did not think of herself as suspicious by nature. She thought of herself, rather, as attentive, a small but crucial distinction that had solved a surprising number of village mysteries over a surprising number of years. It was Mrs. Ashworth, her cousin's neighbour, who first mentioned the knitting circle, and mentioned it in the particular hushed, admiring tone the English reserve for institutions that have outlasted several vicars and at least one war. 11 years, she said. The same 6 women, the same Thursday, the same parlour at Blackiston Cottage, presided over by dear Honoria, who kept a tin of shortbread that never seemed to empty, and a tongue that, while sharp, was never unkind. "You must come and sit with us this once," Mrs. Ashworth said, as though extending an invitation to something faintly sacred, and Miss Marple, who had never in her life declined an opportunity to observe 6 women in close and habitual proximity, said she would be delighted. The cottage, when she reached it that Thursday afternoon, sat back from the lane behind a low wall furred with moss, its windows lit gold against a sky already bruising toward evening. Inside, the parlour was warm in the particular way of rooms heated by a fire that has been burning most of the day, and it smelled of wool and beeswax polish and the ghost of baking. 6 women sat in a loose, companionable circle, chairs angled just so, the geometry of long habit, their needles moving with the unconscious fluency of hands that had performed the same motions 10,000 times. Miss Marple was given the good chair near the fire, and a cup of tea in china so fine it seemed almost an impertinence to drink from it. And for the better part of an hour she said very little and observed a great deal. She observed, for instance, that Honoria Blackiston, a handsome, silver-haired woman of 78, with a laugh like a struck bell, governed the room not through volume, but through a kind of settled certainty, the ease of someone who has occupied the same chair, metaphorically and literally, for the whole of her adult life. She observed that Mrs. Prentice knitted with a violence quite disproportionate to her placid conversation, as though some old grievance were being worked out stitch by stitch. She observed the quiet one, a widow, someone murmured, a Mrs. Pargeter, who sat slightly outside the circle's warmth, despite sitting within its physical bounds, her needles moving with a neatness so precise it seemed almost a discipline rather than a pleasure. It was a stranger, a young man from the county surveyor's office, come to measure the lane for some drainage scheme, and invited in out of the rain for a cup of tea he clearly had not expected to receive, who broke, quite innocently, the room's careful equilibrium. Making conversation, he mentioned that he'd been reading through some old parish disputes that morning, and hadn't there been some business, years back, about a servant girl, a cotter, was it, who'd come to a bad end on these very stairs. The silence that followed was not long. It could not have lasted more than 2 or 3 seconds. But Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime cataloguing the precise weight and texture of silences, felt this one settle over the room like a held breath. Honoria's needles did not pause, but her smile, for just a moment, became something painted rather than felt. Mrs. Prentice's hands went still entirely, and the quiet widow, Mrs. Pargeter, looked up, not startled, not guilty exactly, but with an expression of such carefully controlled attention that Miss Marple, watching over the rim of her teacup, felt the small cold click of a mind filing something away for later. Then Honoria laughed her bell laugh and said, "Good heavens! Ancient history, my dear boy. Do have another scone." And the room breathed again, and the needles resumed their gentle clicking, and Miss Marple thought no more of it, or told herself she did not, as she walked back through the darkening lane to her cousin's house, beneath a sky now fully given over to rain. She was woken past midnight by an urgent, apologetic knocking. The vicar stood on the step, hatless, his coat thrown on over his nightshirt, his face the colour of old candle wax in the lamplight. "Miss Marple, forgive me. I didn't know who else to come to. Honoria Blackiston is dead. She's fallen. The stairs." He stopped, swallowed, and said the thing that would lodge itself, small and sharp as a needle, in Miss Marple's mind for weeks to come. "She wanted to tell you something. She told me only yesterday. She said she'd tell you tomorrow." Chapter 2. An accident, everyone agrees. The rain had stopped by morning, but the village wore its aftermath like a grey shawl, and Miss Marple, walking to church for the announcement of the funeral arrangements, found Little Wickham subdued in the particular way of places that have decided, collectively and without discussion, upon the shape a tragedy is permitted to take. The verdict? She heard it repeated at the baker's, at the post office, in the low murmurs outside the lich gate, had settled with remarkable speed and remarkable uniformity. A loose stair rod, long neglected, a woman of 78 descending in the dark to fetch a shawl or a book. A single misstep, misadventure. The coroner had used the word himself, and the village had received it gratefully, the way one receives any explanation that requires nothing further of one's conscience. Miss Marple said nothing to contradict this consensus, though she noted, with the quiet persistence of a woman assembling a jigsaw whose picture she did not yet know, that Honoria Blackiston had lived in that cottage for 40 years and had, by every account, descended those same stairs in the dark 1,000 times without incident, being neither infirm nor careless, and possessed besides of the sort of brisk, unsentimental competence that did not misjudge a step it had known since girlhood. The funeral was held on a Tuesday of pale, watery sunshine, the church filled to its modest capacity with villagers in their good dark clothes. The vicar's voice carrying the particular gentle solemnity he reserved for deaths that were sudden, but not, strictly speaking, tragic in the operatic sense. No young life cut short, only an old woman gone rather sooner than expected. Miss Marple sat near the back, from which vantage point she could observe, without appearing to observe, the 6 women of the knitting circle arranged in the second pew like a set of matched ornaments, black-gloved hands folded, faces composed into the expressions grief is expected to wear. And it was here that Miss Marple began, gently, to notice things. Mrs. Prentice wept, audibly, copiously, into a handkerchief already damp, and yet her weeping had about it the quality of a performance well rehearsed, each sob arriving on cue, her eyes darting once or twice toward the rest of the pew, as though checking that her grief was being adequately witnessed. Two other women, Mrs. Fenwick and a Miss Ada Thorne, whom Miss Marple had not properly met, wore the smooth, dry-eyed solemnity of those attending a funeral out of obligation rather than sorrow, their faces arranged correctly, but their attention wandering, once, twice, to the arrangement of lilies, to the hymn number, to the weather visible through the high windows. This was not remarkable in itself. Grief wore many faces, and not all of them were tears. But it was the sixth woman, the quiet widow from the fireside, Mrs. Pargeter, who arrested Miss Marple's attention entirely, for she alone among the six sat with an absolute, wordless stillness, her hands gripping one another in her lap so tightly that even from her distance Miss Marple could see the knuckles whitened, her eyes fixed on the coffin with an expression that was not performed grief, but something rawer and more private. The look, Miss Marple thought, of someone grieving not a friend, but a version of events that had just permanently, irretrievably closed. It was a small thing. It was the sort of small thing that Miss Marple had learned, over a very long life, in a very small village of her own, was rarely small at all. After the service, standing in the churchyard among the murmured condolences and the rustle of black crape, Miss Marple found herself drawn into conversation with Colonel Whitfield's solicitor, a dry, precise little man named Mr. Ashby Stern, who mentioned, in the incidental way solicitors mention things they consider matters of public record rather than confidence, that the cottage and its contents would want sorting before the estate could be settled, and that Honoria's few surviving connections in the village, being fond of her, might wish to assist. Miss Marple, who had cultivated over the decades a talent for being present exactly where useful information was likely to surface, volunteered herself at once, with the mild, harmless enthusiasm of an old woman glad of something to occupy her remaining days in the village. She went to the cottage 2 days later in the company of Mrs. Ashworth and a rather harried young clerk from Ashby Stern's office, and found it strange, she who had visited only once, on that firelit Thursday, to see the parlour now cold and still, the chairs pushed back from their accustomed circle, the tea-things long since washed and put away by some dutiful hand. The house had that particular hush that settles over rooms whose owner will not return to disturb them, a hush Miss Marple had encountered often enough in her life to recognize it as something almost physical, a held note waiting to resolve. They worked through the morning with the brisk, slightly guilty efficiency of people sorting a stranger's most private effects, linens folded, letters bundled for the solicitor, a small box of jewellery set aside for the nephew, and it was in the course of this that Miss Marple, moving to clear the little writing desk beneath the window, came upon the sewing-box. It was a handsome thing, walnut, brass-cornered, the sort of box a woman might have owned for 30 years and used every day of them, and it sat locked, its small brass keyhole catching the grey window light. Miss Marple tried the lid gently, out of habit more than expectation, and found it firm. "The key will be about somewhere," Mrs. Ashworth said, without much interest, continuing to fold table linen. "She kept it on her chatelaine, I believe, with the others." But the chatelaine, when the clerk produced it from the dead woman's dressing table, a modest silver chain hung with the small useful keys of a well-run household, the pantry, the writing desk, the tea-caddy, held no key that matched the sewing box's small, old-fashioned lock. They searched the desk drawers. They searched the mantel, the dresser, the pockets of the cardigan still hanging on its peg by the door, worn soft at the elbows, smelling faintly of lavender water in a way that made Mrs. Ashworth's eyes fill briefly and turn away. They searched, thoroughly, patiently, the clerk growing increasingly puzzled, every place a small brass key might reasonably be kept in a house of settled, unhurried habits. It was nowhere. Not in the cottage, not among the dead woman's effects, not, as Mr. Ashby Stern would confirm the following week, with the faint bafflement of a man encountering a detail too small to matter and yet too odd to entirely dismiss, anywhere upon her person when she was found. Miss Marple stood before the locked box in the cold afternoon light of the empty parlour, her hand resting lightly upon its walnut lid, and felt, quite distinctly, the small cold certainty that had visited her at other times, in other villages, before other unpleasantnesses had properly declared themselves. "A woman does not lose the key to her own sewing box," she thought. "A woman locks a box because there is something inside it she does not wish found. And if the key is gone, then someone had wished, quite urgently, that it should not be found either." She said nothing of this to Mrs. Ashworth, who was already moving on to the linen cupboard with the placid unconcern of the entirely innocent. But as they left the cottage that evening, Miss Marple looked back once at the darkened window of the parlour, and thought of the quiet widow's white-knuckled hands in the second pew, and wondered, with the patient, unhurried dread of a woman who has learned that villages keep their secrets the way old houses keep their draughts, seeping in slowly from somewhere one cannot quite locate, what Honoria Blackiston had been so determined that no one should discover, and whether the person who had taken that key had done so before her death, or only after. Chapter 3. The Unpicked Row. It was a full week before the sewing box was opened, Mr. Ashby Stern having judged it prudent to send for a locksmith from the county town rather than force so handsome a piece, and in that week Miss Marple occupied herself in the unhurried, apparently aimless manner that had so often, in the past, concealed a mind working at considerable speed beneath a placid surface. She took tea with Mrs. Ashworth. She admired the last of the Michaelmas daisies. She walked, twice, past Blakiston Cottage in the grey afternoon light, noting without seeming to note the crape still tied upon the gate, the curtains drawn in the parlour, the small, ordinary desolation of a house whose rhythms have stopped. The box was opened, at last, in the presence of Mr. Ashby Stern, the nephew's representative, and, at Mrs. Ashworth's kindly insistence, since Miss Marple had, after all, assisted so ably with the sorting, Miss Marple herself, standing a little apart by the cold hearth with her hands folded, the very picture of a harmless old woman with no interest beyond politeness in the proceedings. The lock gave with a small, dry click, and the lid rose to reveal what such boxes always reveal, The ordinary archaeology of a life spent with a needle, reels of thread in graduated colours, a pincushion shaped like a strawberry, a folded pattern clipped from some decades-old magazine, buttons of bone and horn kept in a tobacco tin. And beneath these, wrapped in tissue paper gone soft and yellow with handling, a half-finished scarf in a fine grey-blue wool, the needles still threaded through the last worked row, exactly as its knitter had left it. It was, on its face, nothing at all, the unremarkable relic of an old woman's ordinary evening occupation, the sort of thing found in every household in England, where women of a certain age and habit had passed their winters. Mr. Ashby Stern glanced at it without interest, and turned to the more pressing matter of a bundle of correspondence beneath. But Miss Marple, whose eye had been trained by 60 years of her own needles to read the small grammar of knitted wool the way a scholar reads a difficult hand, found herself unable to look away from it. She asked, with the mild, apologetic curiosity of an old woman indulging a harmless interest, whether she might hold it a moment, and Mrs. Ashworth, seeing no reason to refuse, passed it to her. The pattern was a simple one, a moss stitch bordered in cable, worked with the even, practiced tension of a woman who had knitted daily for 50 years, and it was this very evenness that made the anomaly, when Miss Marple's fingers found it, so immediately and unmistakably wrong. Some 8 or 9 rows from the needle's end, the tension of the stitches altered, subtly, but to a trained eye unmistakably, tightening and shifting in the particular way wool does when a row has been unpicked and re-knitted by a different hand, or by the same hand in a different state of mind. The wool itself, on close inspection, was not quite the same shade, a fraction bluer, a fraction newer, as though drawn from a different ball entirely, purchased perhaps to match as closely as memory allowed, but not quite succeeding. Someone, Miss Marple understood with the small, cold certainty of a woman fitting the last piece into a pattern she had not yet consciously assembled, had unravelled a portion of this scarf after it left Honoria Blackiston's hands, and had carefully, patiently, reworked it, and had done so, moreover, with sufficient care and sufficient time to suggest not haste but deliberation. She said nothing of this to Mr. Ashby Stern. She folded the scarf again into its tissue paper with the same unhurried gentleness she might have shown any relic of the dead, and set it down, and allowed the conversation to move on to the correspondence, the accounts, the small tedious business of an estate being settled. But that evening, walking home through a dusk smelling of wood smoke and wet leaves, she turned the matter over with the particular patience of a woman who had long ago learned that the truth of a village rarely announced itself. It had to be drawn out, gently, the way one draws a difficult thread through a narrow eye, by asking the right small questions of the right small people and listening, above all, to what was left unsaid. She began, over the following days, a quiet campaign of visits to Mrs. Fenwick, ostensibly to return a borrowed pattern book, to Miss Ada Thorne, ostensibly to discuss the church bazaar, to Mrs. Prentice, ostensibly for no reason at all beyond the pleasant idleness of 2 elderly women with time on their hands. In each case she steered the conversation with the practised indirection of long habit, toward the evening of Honoria's death, who had called, who had stayed, who had gone home when, and in each case received answers so smooth, so consistent, so evidently well rehearsed among themselves, that Miss Marple found herself more troubled by their very uniformity than she would have been by any contradiction. Mrs. Fenwick had left at 8:30. Miss Thorne had walked home with her, the two of them parting at the crossroads. Mrs. Prentice had stayed rather later, helping Honoria clear the tea things, and had left, she said, before 9, finding the house entirely as usual. Honoria, entirely as usual. Nothing at all, amiss. It was on this last point that Mrs. Prentice's composure, ordinarily so brisk and certain, first showed a hairline crack. Miss Marple, sitting in Mrs. Prentice's own small, overfull parlour, with a cup of tea cooling untouched in her hand, had asked, gently, almost idly, as though the question had only just occurred to her, whether Honoria had ever seemed troubled of late, whether anything at all had seemed to weigh upon her. Mrs. Prentice's needles, which had been moving throughout their conversation with brisk, competent regularity, went suddenly and completely still. "Troubled," she repeated, in a voice that had lost, quite abruptly, its earlier ease. No, I shouldn't say troubled." A pause, during which her eyes moved, not to Miss Marple, but to the window, to the darkening garden beyond it, as though seeking permission from someone not present. Honoria was always one to let old business lie. We all were. We all learned to, years back. She stopped, seeming to hear the words only after she had spoken them, and a flush crept up from her collar, unbecoming and involuntary. "Old business," Miss Marple repeated, with the mild, encouraging blankness of a woman who has understood a great deal more than she is letting show. "It's nothing." Mrs. Prentice's hands twisted together in her lap, the abandoned knitting sliding half off her knee. "It's nothing. It's ancient history. We all know what happened to that girl, but it's ancient history now, and no good ever came of digging up." She stopped herself with an almost physical violence, as though she had bitten down upon her own tongue, and when she looked up, her face had gone the colour of tallow, her eyes wide with the particular horror of a woman who has heard herself say, aloud, in plain daylight, a thing she had kept locked away for 30 years. "I think," she said, in a voice gone suddenly small and formal, rising to set down her tea, her hands trembling visibly upon the saucer. "I think I've said quite enough for one afternoon, Miss Marple. I'd be obliged if you'd forgive me. I find I have rather a headache coming on." And she would say, Miss Marple understood at once, watching the woman's rigid, retreating back as she was shown, with unmistakable finality, to the door. She would say no more on the subject that day, nor perhaps on any day thereafter. But the words hung in the cooling parlour air behind her, 4 words that Miss Marple carried out into the darkening lane like a small, cold stone pressed into her palm. That girl. What happened to that girl? Chapter 4. The Nephew's Debts. Colonel Whitfield arrived in Little Wickham on a Friday, by motor car rather than the omnibus, a distinction the village noted and discussed with the mild, appraising interest it reserved for anything that suggested a man thought rather better of himself than his circumstances entirely warranted. He was Honoria's only nephew, the son of a brother long dead, a heavy, florid man in his 50s, with the loud, hearty manner of someone accustomed to filling a room, and rather less accustomed to anyone questioning his right to do so. And he took rooms at the Bell rather than the cottage, a choice that struck Miss Marple, when she heard of it, as faintly curious, since the cottage would shortly be his own, and stood, moreover, entirely empty. She was introduced to him properly at Mr. Ashby Stern's office, whither she had gone under the pretext of returning some small item of Honoria's. A thimble, as it happened, genuinely mislaid among her own things during the sorting, and found him in the outer room, red-faced and impatient, remonstrating with the young clerk about the length of time an estate might reasonably be expected to take in settling. He broke off his complaint to greet her with a heartiness that did not entirely mask the calculation beneath it, the quick, practiced glance of a man assessing whether a new acquaintance might prove useful or merely tedious, and Miss Marple, recognizing the type at once, several such having crossed her path over the years in villages not unlike this one, allowed herself to be taken for tedious and harmless, and was rewarded, as she generally was, with rather more candour than the Colonel had perhaps intended. "Damned inconvenient business, all this," he said, settling into the chair beside her with the air of a man glad of any audience. "I'd business of my own waiting on this, arrangements made, obligations, you understand, and now I'm told it may be months before probate's settled. Months, mark you, over a cottage and a few £100 worth of furniture." He caught himself, perhaps hearing how this sounded spoken so soon after his aunt's funeral, and added, with the belated air of a man remembering the correct sentiment, "Not that the money signifies, of course. One doesn't think of such things at a time like this. It's the delay that frets a man." Miss Marple, murmuring something sympathetic and entirely non-committal, permitted him to continue, and continue he did, at some length, on the subject of solicitors and their tortoise-like habits, until Mrs. Ashworth's sister, who kept the bell and was, in the manner of village innkeepers everywhere, an inexhaustible reservoir of information freely dispensed, supplied, over the course of the following days, the context the Colonel himself had been careful to omit. He was, it emerged, considerably in debt, a matter of unwise investments and a fondness for the racecourse that had outrun his modest army pension some years past, and had visited his aunt not 3 weeks before her death, arriving unannounced and departing. By the account of the woman who did for Honoria twice weekly, in a state of visible agitation, his voice raised loud enough to carry through the parlour window into the garden, where the char had been pegging out washing, and had heard, without particularly meaning to, rather more than either party would have wished. Wanted money off her, he did, the woman told Mrs. Ashworth's sister, who relayed it to Miss Marple with the relish of one passing on a choice piece of scandal. An advance, he called it, against what was coming to him anyway, seeing as she'd no one else to leave it to. And Miss Blackiston, she wasn't having it. Told him plain she'd not be bullied into signing anything before her time, and if he'd managed his affairs so poorly, he'd have to manage his own way out of them. A pause, delivered with evident satisfaction. He went off in a rare temper, slammed the gate so hard it come off its hinge, near enough, and didn't come back, not till after she was found, that is. Miss Marple received this information with the same mild, unhurried interest she brought to all such intelligence, and turned it over privately with rather more care than her expression betrayed. A nephew, in want of money, refused it by the aunt whose death would deliver it to him regardless. It was, she reflected, precisely the sort of circumstance a lesser observer of village life might seize upon with some satisfaction, motive, and opportunity arranged as neatly as a hand of cards. and yet something in it sat wrong with her, in the way a stitch dropped several rows back will sit wrong beneath the fingers long before the eye discovers the hole it has left. The Colonel's grievance, real and evidently freshly raw, was a grievance about money withheld, not money threatened. And there was, besides, the small matter of the sewing box, the rewoven row, the missing key, none of which bore any obvious relation to a nephew's debts. A man in want of an inheritance might, conceivably, hasten its arrival. He would have little cause to unpick and rework a dead woman's knitting, nor to remove, so carefully, whatever the box had once concealed. It was this thought, the thought of what the box might once have concealed, that led her, the following afternoon, to the vicarage, where she found the vicar, a mild, stooping man named Mr. Colby, engaged in the unglamorous work of parish administration among a great many dusty ledgers. She asked him, with the apologetic vagueness of an old woman indulging a passing whim, whether the parish kept records reaching back some 30 years or more. She had heard mention, she said, of some old trouble in the village, a servant girl, she believed, though she could not now recall who had told her, and watched, with the close, unobtrusive attention she brought to all such moments, as Mr. Colby's mild face underwent a small but unmistakable change, a stillness settling over it that had nothing to do with the dust of his ledgers. "The Cotter business," he said, after a moment, in a voice grown careful. "Yes, that would be before my time here, of course. But one hears things, in a parish. A parlour-maid, I believe. A fall." He did not meet her eye. "Ruled misadventure, as I recall." "Misadventure," Miss Marple repeated softly, and something in her tone, nothing overt, nothing that could have been called a challenge, seemed none the less to reach him, for his hands, resting on the ledger before him, went briefly still in a manner she had now seen too many times, in too many hands, to mistake for anything but recognition. "Miss Marple." He looked up at last, and there was in his face something almost pleading, the look of a decent man asked to choose between two loyalties he had not sought and did not welcome. "I wonder whether it does any good, raking over such old griefs. The village has long since put it behind it. Whatever happened, happened a very long time ago, to people mostly gone now themselves. I wonder," Miss Marple said gently, "whether it has been put behind it, Mr. Colby, or only put away. There is a difference, I think, though it is not always easy to tell the one from the other until something forces the drawer open again." He held her gaze a long moment, and then, with the slow reluctance of a man surrendering something he had genuinely hoped never to be asked for, rose and crossed to the heavy oak cupboard where the parish registers were kept, drawing out a ring of small keys from his waistcoat pocket. "The register for that year is here," he said, his hand resting on the cupboard door, not yet opening it. "I'll not pretend I don't know which entry you're asking after. I looked at it myself, not long since. Honoria asked to see it, in fact, only a fortnight before she died." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped, as though the words themselves were reluctant to be spoken aloud in the quiet, dust-mellow room. "She sat with it a long while, Miss Marple, longer than a woman reads a parish register for idle curiosity, and when she gave it back to me, she said, I've thought of it often since, she said, some things were better left in that drawer, Mr. Colby, and I have been the one keeping them there far too long." Chapter 5. Ivy Cotter. The register, when Mr. Colby finally drew it from its cupboard and laid it upon the vicarage table between them, was a heavy, calf-bound volume, smelling of dust and old ink, its pages the soft, brittle brown of paper that has spent 30 years undisturbed. He turned to the entry with the practiced ease of a man who had, despite his protestations, consulted it rather more recently than he had first admitted, and set his finger beside a line of faded copperplate that recorded, in the flat, indifferent language of parish bureaucracy, the burial of one Ivy Cotter, spinster, aged 19, of Blakiston Cottage, died by misadventure, a fall. Miss Marple read it twice, slowly, the way she read all things that mattered, and found herself struck less by what the entry said than by what it declined to say. No mention of circumstance, no note of inquest beyond the bare verdict, nothing of the kind of small explanatory detail a parish clerk might ordinarily append to soften a young life's abrupt conclusion. It had the particular blankness, she thought, of a record written to close a matter rather than to describe one. 19, she said quietly. So young. So, I understand. Mr. Colby's voice remained careful, a man picking his way across ground he had not chosen to walk. A parlour-maid in the Blakiston household, as I recall being told. This would have been old Mr. Blakiston's time, Honoria's father, and Honoria herself would have been mistress of the house not long after, her mother having died some years before, and her father being largely an invalid by then. He paused. I don't know more than that, Miss Marple, and what I do know, I know only from things half said over 30 years by people who did not wish to say them fully. It was this observation, that the fullest knowledge of the matter would lie not in written registers but in living memory, however reluctant, that sent Miss Marple the following morning along the lane to a small, ivy-choked cottage at the far edge of the village, where old Josiah Fenn, who had been under-gardener at Blakiston Cottage in the years before the First War, and was now well past 80, sat most mornings in a chair by his window, watching the lane with the placid, inexhaustible attention of a man for whom the passing of a cart or a bicycle constituted the day's principal entertainment. He received her with the courtly, slightly bewildered pleasure of the very old at any visitor, and Miss Marple, seating herself in the chair opposite and accepting a cup of tea she suspected had been made rather too strong through simple forgetfulness, allowed the conversation to wander pleasantly through the weather and the state of his roses before turning it, with practised gentleness, toward the Blakiston household of his youth. His memory, she found, was a curious instrument, vague and wandering on matters of recent weeks, his own breakfast sometimes forgotten by noon, and yet startlingly, vividly precise on matters 30 and 40 years gone, as though the mind, in its old age, kept its earliest rooms best furnished and let the newer ones stand empty. He remembered old Mr. Blakiston well, a hard man, he said, close with his money and closer with his temper, and he remembered, when she asked, gently, whether he recalled a parlour-maid named Cotter, a sudden stillness coming over his weathered face, not unlike the stillness she had observed in Mrs. Prentice's parlour, in Mr. Colby's study, the stillness, she was beginning to understand, of a village remembering something it had spent 30 years agreeing not to remember. Ivy, he said slowly, as though tasting the name for the first time in decades. I mind Ivy Cotter. Pretty girl, dark hair, quick with her hands, came from over Medbury Way. No family to speak of hereabouts. He was quiet a moment, his gaze drifting to the window, to the lane, to some middle distance, considerably further off than the hedgerow. Terrible thing that was, terrible thing, and hushed up quick, the way such things were, in those days, if a family had the standing to hush them. Hushed up, Miss Marple repeated gently. There was talk. He said it reluctantly, the words coming slow, as though drawn up from some deep and silted well. Servants' talk, whatever the family thinks. There was talk that Ivy hadn't fallen so much as been pushed, or driven to it some other way, and the talk had a name attached, though I'll not say I ever knew it for certain myself, only what was said below stairs and never above them. He glanced at Miss Marple, a flicker of old caution crossing his face even now, even after 30 years, even to a stranger he would likely never see again after that morning. Miss Honoria's sister, it was said. Young Miss Clara. Sweet on nobody's business but her own, that one, and there'd been some falling out between her and Ivy not long before. Over what? I never rightly knew, though a body could guess. A pretty girl and a household full of gentlemen's sons about, and Miss Clara none too pleased about it, whatever it was. Miss Marple sat very still, turning this new thread over with care, feeling it settle against the others she had already gathered. The rewoven row, the missing key, Mrs. Prentice's stricken that girl, Honoria's own words to the vicar about drawers better left shut, and finding, with the particular satisfaction of a pattern beginning at last to declare its shape, that it fit. And Honoria, she said carefully, what became of her in all this? She would have been mistress of the house by then, or nearly. Ay, near enough, her father failing as he was. Josiah's face had grown heavier, the memory plainly costing him something even now. She was the one settled it, if settling's the word, sent Miss Clara off to relations in the north not a fortnight after, and the inquest went the way the family wanted it to go, as inquests mostly did in those days when a family had the doctor's ear and the coroner's besides. Misadventure they called it, and misadventure it stayed, and nobody in this village has said Ivy Cotter's name above a whisper since. Not in 30 years. Not till you asked it just now, Miss Marple. And I'll confess it's given me a turn to say it out loud again after all this time. He fell silent, his old hands trembling faintly around his own cooling teacup, and Miss Marple allowed the silence to sit a moment, unhurried, before asking the question that had been forming, quietly, at the edge of her mind since Josiah first spoke the dead girl's name. Had she any family, Mr. Fenn? Ivy Cotter? Any who might have wondered, all these years, what truly became of her? The old man's face, when he answered, had the look of a man reaching for something long buried, and finding it, to his own faint surprise, still there. Now that you ask it, he said slowly, there was a child. I'd near forgot it myself. It's that long since I've thought on it. A baby girl, born some months before Ivy died, no husband ever spoken of, and the family keeping the whole business as quiet as they kept the rest of it. He shook his head, an old man's small, helpless gesture at the passage of so much time. What became of that child, I couldn't tell you, Miss Marple. Given away, I'd think, to some family or other, the way such things were managed then. Nobody in this village ever spoke of it again. Nobody ever spoke of what became of it at all. Chapter 6. A face cut from a photograph. The vicarage, Miss Marple recalled, kept in its parlour a small collection of framed photographs documenting the parish's various anniversaries and jubilees, and it was Mrs. Colby, a plump, cheerful woman who took a keen and entirely unmalicious interest in the village's history, who mentioned, over tea a few days after Miss Marple's conversation with old Josiah Fenn, that there existed somewhere among the vicarage's papers a photograph of the Blakiston household staff, taken, she believed, at the old Queen's Jubilee, and would Miss Marple care to see it, since she seemed to have taken such an interest lately in the family's history. Miss Marple said that she would care to see it a great deal. The photograph, when it was found, after some searching through a battered tin box of loose prints kept in the vicarage's box-room, among faded images of long-dismantled feats and forgotten cricket 11s, showed a row of some dozen servants arranged before the cottage's front door in the stiff, unsmiling formality the camera had demanded of an earlier age. A butler, a cook of formidable girth, a scattering of housemaids and gardeners in their good aprons and caps, old Josiah Fenn himself, recognizable among them as a startlingly young man with dark hair and an expression of frank discomfort at being photographed at all. It was the third figure from the left, however, that drew Miss Marple's eye and held it. Where a face should have been, a young woman's face, judging by the slight, aproned figure and the cap set at the same neat angle as the other housemaids, there was instead a small, precise absence, a careful oval excised from the print, with a blade so sharp and a hand so steady that the surrounding image remained entirely undisturbed, the edges of the cut clean and deliberate, rather than torn in anger or haste. It was not the work of a moment's fury. It was the work of someone who had sat down with the photograph, and a knife, and a very particular purpose, and had taken their time about it. "Good heavens!" Mrs. Colby said, peering over her shoulder with mild surprise. "I never noticed that before. How odd! I wonder who did that. And why?" "I wonder," Miss Marple agreed softly, "very much indeed." She examined the mutilation with the close, patient attention she had brought to the rewoven row in Honoria's scarf, and found that although the face itself was gone, a small detail had survived at the photograph's very edge, just beyond the reach of whatever blade had done the cutting. A narrow ribbon, tied in a small bow at the collar of the apron, visible only as the faintest pale mark against the grey tones of the print, easily overlooked by anyone not already searching for precisely such a thing. It was a distinctive style, that ribbon, the sort a housemaid might have worn as her single small vanity, her one permitted departure from uniform plainness. And Miss Marple, looking at it, felt the quiet, cold certainty of recognition stir somewhere at the back of her mind, though she could not yet say from where. She asked Mrs. Colby, as casually as she was able, whether the photograph might be dated with any precision, and learned that it had indeed been taken the summer of the old Queen's Jubilee, the very summer, Miss Marple calculated silently, in which Ivy Cotter had died. She carried the memory of that ribbon with her for the better part of a week, turning it over in idle moments the way one turns over a half-recalled tune, certain of having heard it somewhere and unable to place precisely where, until the following Thursday, when she found herself once more, at Mrs. Ashworth's kind and persistent invitation, Seated by the parlour fire at what remained of the knitting circle, now meeting at Mrs. Fenwick's house in a subdued, uncertain sort of continuation of old habit, the 6 women, 5 now, with Honoria gone, though they still spoke of themselves as 6 from long custom, arranged once more in their familiar loose circle, needles moving, conversation low. It was Mrs. Pargeter, Dorothy, as Miss Marple had by now learned to call her, though the quiet widow remained, even among her old companions, somehow apart, a figure at the circle's edge rather than its centre, who rose to fetch the tea-things, and it was in bending to retrieve her sewing-basket from beneath her chair, the better to clear a space upon the small table beside her, that the basket's contents shifted, and something small and pale slipped for a moment into visibility among the balls of wool and the folded pattern papers, before Dorothy's hand closed over it and tucked it away again with a swift, unconscious neatness. A ribbon, small, faded to the colour of old ivory, pinned, not loose among the sewing things, but pinned, deliberately, to the basket's inner lining, in the manner of a keepsake rather than a spare notion, its shape and style precisely, unmistakably, the shape and style of the ribbon Miss Marple had glimpsed at the torn edge of the vicarage photograph not a week before. She said nothing. She accepted her cup of tea from Dorothy's hand, with the same mild, pleasant thanks she offered every week, and remarked upon the fineness of the wool Mrs. Fenwick was working, and allowed the conversation to move on around her through its accustomed channels of village news and small domestic complaint. But she had looked up, in the instant before Dorothy's hand closed over the basket, directly into the other woman's face, and had found Dorothy Pargeter looking back at her, not with the unconscious ease of a woman caught in some trivial, meaningless act, but with an attention so sudden, so sharp, so entirely at odds with her habitual quiet reserve, that it seemed for one unguarded moment to strip away 30 years of careful, practiced invisibility and reveal something watchful and cold beneath it, a look gone again almost before it had registered, replaced at once by the mild, pleasant blankness Dorothy wore as consistently and as carefully as she wore her plain grey cardigan, but not quite quickly enough. Miss Marple sipped her tea and admired the wool and said nothing at all of what she had seen, but she understood, with the settling, inevitable clarity of a woman watching the final pieces of a long pattern click at last into their places, that she had been looking, these past weeks, for a child given away 30 years before, raised under some other name in some other household, grown now into a quiet widow who sat each Thursday among the very women who had helped bury her mother's true history along with her body, and that the child had, at some point she could not yet determine, discovered exactly who she was, and exactly what had been done, and had come back to Little Wickham, not to grieve, but to watch, and to wait, and to knit, patiently, alongside the women who did not know that the ghost they had spent 30 years so carefully avoiding had been sitting among them all along, counting her stitches, and counting too, perhaps, something rather less forgiving than stitches. Chapter 7. The Gardener's Secret. It was Mrs. Ashworth's sister at the Bell who first mentioned, in the off-hand manner of one repeating gossip too commonplace to seem significant, that Tom Reeves, who did the gardens for half the village including, until recently, Bleckiston Cottage, had been seen on the evening of Honoria's death, lingering about the lane near the cottage gate, well past the hour any honest man might be expected to be there on garden business, and had gone, moreover, rather quickly and rather quietly the other way when old Mrs. Fenn's dog set up a barking that might otherwise have drawn attention to him. Miss Marple received this piece of information with the same unhurried attentiveness she brought to all such fragments, neither dismissing it nor seizing upon it, but setting it carefully aside alongside the ribbon, the rewoven row, the missing key, to be weighed later against whatever else the pattern might yield. She had learned, over a great many years of village life, that a man lingering furtively near the scene of a death was as likely to be guilty of something entirely unrelated to that death as he was to be guilty of the death itself. Village knights held a great many small secrets, quite apart from murder, but that the furtiveness itself was rarely worth ignoring, whatever its true cause proved to be. She found Tom Reeves the following afternoon in the churchyard of all places, tending with rather more diligence than the task strictly required to a flower bed along the south wall, a broad-shouldered man of perhaps 40, with the weathered, careful hands of his trade, and a manner, when she approached him, that shifted almost at once from easy civility to a wariness he could not quite conceal beneath it. She did not approach the matter directly. One so rarely got the truth by approaching things directly, she had found, particularly from a man already half-braced for accusation, but spoke instead, at some length and with real interest, of the state of Honoria's own garden, which she had noticed, on her visits to the cottage, showed signs of a gardener's recent and evidently affectionate care. The roses pruned with real skill, the borders kept with an attention that went, she thought, rather beyond the merely professional. Something in this observation, or perhaps only in the gentleness with which it was offered, seemed to loosen something in him, for he set down his trowel and looked at her with the sudden, unguarded directness of a man too tired of carrying a weight alone to refuse, any longer, an offered hand. "You'll have heard I was about the lane that night," he said, not quite a question. "I had heard something of the kind," Miss Marple admitted gently, "though I should say, Mr. Reeves, that I have found in a long life that a man seen where he oughtn't to be is very often a man with a private trouble of his own, and very rarely a man with a guilty hand in someone else's." He was silent a long moment, his eyes on the flower bed rather than on her, and when he spoke again, it was in the low, halting voice of a confession too long postponed. "There's a woman," he said, "married, and not to me, and I'll not say her name, nor yours, nor anyone's business who she is, only that we've an understanding between us that would ruin her entirely if it came to light, and near enough ruin me besides, gardening work being what it is, in a village where everyone knows everyone's doings." He glanced up at her, a flush of old shame colouring his weathered face. "We meet where we can, when we can, and that evening it was the lane by the cottage, her husband being away, and the hour late enough that decent folk were mostly indoors. I saw nothing amiss at the cottage itself. The parlour light was on, same as always of a Thursday, and I thought no more of it, being occupied with matters rather closer to my own concerns. When I heard next morning what had happened, I own I was afraid of being asked what I was doing there, and having to answer it, and the answer doing more harm to an innocent woman than any lie about a murder could ever have done to me." Miss Marple listened to this with the quiet, unjudging attention she reserved for all such small human frailties, and found herself believing him entirely. His shame was too raw, too specific, too evidently costly to himself to be the manufactured shame of a guiltier man reaching for a lesser sin to hide behind a greater one. She asked him, gently, whether he had seen anyone else about the lane or the cottage that evening. Any figure, any light, anything at all that had struck him at the time as unusual, even if it had not seemed to matter. He considered this with the slow care of a man determined, now that he had begun, to be entirely honest, and said at last that he recalled seeing, as he came away up the lane toward the crossroads, a figure leaving the cottage by the side door rather than the front. A woman, he thought, though the hour was dark and his own attention occupied elsewhere, moving quickly and without a light in the direction of the village rather than toward her own home, if she were, as he'd have guessed from the direction, one of the circle women who lived out past the church. He could say no more than that. No face, no certain identity, only the impression of a figure moving with purpose through the dark, and Miss Marple, thanking him with real kindness and promising, as she meant to keep, that his own private trouble would go no further through any word of hers, took her leave and walked back through the churchyard with the particular, unsettled feeling of a woman who has cleared away one obstruction only to find the ground beneath it rather more disturbed than she had expected. It was on the walk home, turning this new fragment over, a figure leaving by the side door, moving quickly, without a light, that another matter surfaced in her mind, one she had noted at the time without quite registering its weight. The tea things at Blackiston Cottage, laid out and later cleared with such evident thoroughness on the night of Honoria's death, the parlour found, by every account, in perfect order when the doctor and the constable arrived. She recalled now, with the sudden, cold clarity of a detail long buried surfacing all at once, that Honoria had possessed a particular cup. Old Wedgwood, hairline cracked along its handle, kept apart from its fellows, and used by long habit for no one but herself, the sort of small domestic idiosyncrasy every long-settled household comes to know without remark. She had seen that cup herself. On the single Thursday she had sat among the circle before Honoria's death, set apart on its own saucer at Honoria's elbow. She had not seen it since. Not among the effects sorted with Mrs. Ashworth, not among the crockery listed for the nephew's benefit by Mr. Ashby Sterner's careful clerk, not, she was now entirely certain, turning the memory over with mounting unease, anywhere in the cottage's kitchen on any of her several visits since. A cup used every evening by a woman found dead upon her own stairs. A cup that ought by every reasonable account to have been standing, unwashed perhaps, or washed and set back upon its shelf, wherever the ordinary business of that final evening had left it, was gone. Not misplaced among 100 other pieces of crockery, for she had looked, without quite knowing until this moment that she was looking, and found no chip, nor crack, nor hairline flaw among any cup in that kitchen to match it. Someone, in the confusion of that night, before the doctor came, before the constable came, before anyone thought to ask what an old woman had last had to eat or drink, had removed Honoria Blackiston's cup entirely from the house, and had done so, Miss Marple understood with a slow gathering dread, Not from any tidy instinct of housekeeping, but because that cup, wherever it now lay hidden, held some truth about Honoria's last hour that someone had been very determined indeed. No doctor, no constable, and no quiet old woman with a talent for noticing small things should ever be permitted to find. Chapter 8. Tension in the Wool. There is a particular kind of test, Miss Marple had long ago discovered, that requires no accusation, no confrontation, nothing so crude as a direct question, only the quiet introduction of a single word into an ordinary conversation, and the patient watching of what that word does to the hands of the person who hears it. She had learned this method not from any book of detection, but from a lifetime of village afternoons, watching needles falter over a piece of unwelcome news, watching teaspoons still in their saucers at the mention of a name better left unspoken, and she employed it now. Over the course of a week, with a thoroughness that cost her a great many cups of tea she did not particularly want, and a great many hours of conversation on subjects that interested her only insofar as they permitted her, sooner or later, to introduce the name she had come to say. She called upon Mrs. Fenwick, and spoke, amid other things, of old parish records, and mentioned, as though the thought had only just occurred to her, the name Ivy Cotter, and watched Mrs. Fenwick's face cloud with the ordinary, uncomplicated discomfort of a woman recalling an old unpleasantness she had genuinely, mercifully, been permitted to half forget, her needles slowing but not stopping, her eyes sliding away toward the window with nothing more sinister in them than the wish to speak of pleasanter things. She called upon Miss Ada Thorne and received much the same response. A flicker of unease, quickly suppressed, the reflexive discomfort of a woman touching an old bruise rather than a fresh wound, her hands unsteady for a moment and then resuming their work with the visible effort of someone choosing, deliberately, not to dwell. She called, at last, upon Dorothy Pargeter in the small, neat cottage at the edge of the village where the quiet widow lived alone amid furnishings so carefully ordinary, so entirely without personality, that Miss Marple found herself struck, sitting in the spotless little parlour, by the sense of a room arranged by someone who had spent her whole life learning to leave no trace of herself behind her. They spoke, for the better part of an hour, of the weather, of the church bazaar, of the sad diminishment of the circle since Honoria's death. Dorothy's manner throughout mild, attentive, unfailingly correct, her needles moving with the same neat, disciplined precision Miss Marple had noted on that very first Thursday by Honoria's fire. And then Miss Marple, setting down her teacup with the same unhurried casualness she had employed in every other parlour that week, mentioned the name. The change was so slight that a less practised eye would have missed it entirely. No gasp, no dropped stitch, no widening of the eyes. But Miss Marple, watching Dorothy's hands with the close, particular attention she had trained upon them from the moment she sat down, saw the tension travel through them like a current. The stitches, which had been forming with easy regularity, drew suddenly, minutely tighter, small and hard and cramped, where a moment before they had been loose and even. The wool pulled taut across the needles with a force that had nothing to do with the pattern, and everything to do with something being held, very carefully, very deliberately, under control. "Ivy Cotter," Dorothy repeated, in a voice that had not changed at all. mild and pleasant and entirely composed. "I don't believe I know the name, Miss Marple. Should I?" "Perhaps not," Miss Marple said gently, and allowed the conversation to move on, and said nothing further of the matter for the remainder of her visit, and took her leave, at last, with the same warm, unremarkable thanks she offered at every door in the village. But she carried away with her, walking home through the lane in the thickening dusk, the memory of those small, hard stitches, tightened by a hand that had otherwise given nothing at all away, and understood, with the settled, sorrowful certainty of a woman who had hoped, almost until this moment, to be wrong, that she had found what she had been looking for. It remained only to be certain, and certainty, Miss Marple had learned, was a thing that came not from suspicion, but from records, from the dry, patient, unglamorous business of paper and ink, which did not flatter or deceive or perform grief it did not feel, and told in the end only the truth it had been given to keep. She took the omnibus the following morning to the county town, and spent the better part of a long day in the records office, a cold, high-ceilinged room smelling of dust and old vellum, working her way with the clerk's patient assistance through registers of birth, of adoption, of the small, discreet arrangements by which the county's respectable families had, for generations, disposed of inconvenient children born to servants and unmarried girls. It was slow work and cold work, and more than once Miss Marple thought of Ivy Cotter's face, the face she had never seen, cut so carefully from that old photograph, as she turned page after page of other people's forgotten griefs in search of it. She found it, at last, in a register of parish arrangements some 31 years old, a female infant, born to one Ivy Cotter, unmarried, of Little Wickham, placed within the month of her mother's death with a family named Pargeter, of Medbury, distant relations of the vicar's wife of that time, who had undertaken the child's raising as an act of Christian charity, and had, in the manner of such arrangements, given her their own name, and told her, as she grew, nothing at all of the mother she had lost before she was old enough to remember losing her. Miss Marple sat a long while over that entry, the cold room emptying around her as the light failed at the high windows, and felt not the satisfaction of a puzzle solved, but something heavier and sadder, the recognition of a whole life built, unknowingly, upon a foundation of silence, not her own, a woman raised in ignorance of the very wrong that had shaped every circumstance of her birth, until the day, whenever and however it had come, that the truth had finally reached her, and had reached her, Miss Marple now understood with a certainty that settled cold and final in her chest, not gently. She returned to her lodgings that evening, tired in the particular way sorrow tires a person, quite apart from any exertion of the body, and found, when she reached her door, a small folded paper pushed beneath it, plain, unaddressed, the hand upon it careful and even, and entirely unremarkable, the hand, she thought at once, of a woman long practised in giving nothing away. She unfolded it by the hall lamp before she had even removed her coat, and read, in that neat, composed script, a single line that told her, more clearly than any confession could have done, that she had at last been seen as surely as she herself had been seeing. "You knit a lovely pattern, Miss Marple, but you're reading the wrong row." Chapter 9. What the Vicar Knew. Miss Marple did not sleep well that night, and it was not the note itself that kept her wakeful. A small, cold provocation, no more, the sort of thing a frightened and clever person sends when they wish to test how much ground has truly been lost without admitting to any ground at all. But the sentence's particular phrasing turned over and over in the dark until the house's small settling creaks seemed almost to keep time with her thoughts. "You're reading the wrong row. Not a denial. Not an accusation of error in fact, but of emphasis. As though Dorothy Pargeter, if it was indeed Dorothy's hand that had written it, wished her understood not to be mistaken in her suspicions, but to be mistaken in where she had chosen to rest her sympathy. As a knitter might be told she had counted her stitches correctly, but was following the wrong line of the chart entirely." She rose early, unrested but resolved, and walked to the vicarage before the day's ordinary business had properly begun, finding Mr. Colby at breakfast, still in his dressing gown, his mild face creasing with concern at the sight of her at so unaccustomed an hour. "I find I must ask you something further," she said, accepting the chair he drew out for her, but declining the tea, her manner uncharacteristically without preamble. "And I must ask you to be entirely honest with me, Mr. Colby, whatever loyalty or discretion you feel bound to observe. You told me Honoria came to you a fortnight before her death and asked to see the old register, and said to you that some things had been kept too long in that drawer, and that she had been the one keeping them. I believe you understood, even as she said it, that she meant to do something about it. I believe, moreover, that you have known rather more of what she meant to do than you have yet told me." Mr. Colby set down his knife and fork with the slow, deliberate care of a man buying himself a moment's grace, and when he looked up, his mild face had lost its usual gentle vagueness, replaced by something graver and more tired. "You are right that I have not told you everything," he said. "I did not tell you because it was told to me in confidence, and because I did not, until now, believe it bore upon her death. I believed, God forgive me, that it was only an old woman's late remorse, harmless in itself, however painful its cause." He rose, crossed to his small writing desk, and stood a moment with his hand upon its closed lid, before opening it. "There is something further you should know, Miss Marple. It concerns a letter." He drew out, from among his own private papers, a slim, worn envelope, its seal long broken, and turned it over in his hands before speaking again. "Some 2 years ago," he said, "Honoria came to me, not in the manner of a woman confessing a sin, you understand, but carefully, formally, as one arranging a piece of business, and asked whether I might help her locate a young woman, a Miss Dorothy Pargeter of Medbury, whose circumstances of birth she believed I might, through parish connections, be able to trace without her own name ever entering into the inquiry. I did not ask her reasons. I assumed, I think, some matter of old family charity, a natural enough thing for a woman of her age and means to occupy herself with. I made the inquiries she asked of me, and in time I was able to confirm what she already, I believe, half suspected, that Dorothy Pargeter was indeed the daughter of Ivy Cotter, raised under another name by a family with no knowledge, I am sure, of the child's true history. Miss Marple sat very still, the pieces she had already gathered arranging themselves now around this new and central fact, with the swift, settling clarity of a design at last made visible in full. "And the letter," she said quietly. "Honoria wrote it herself," Mr. Colby said, "and asked me only to see it safely delivered, through channels that would not reveal her as its author. I posted it myself, Miss Marple, addressed in a hand not my own. She had asked a clerk in the county town to copy it out for her, some legal acquaintance she trusted, so that no one, not even the recipient, should know from whom it truly came. I never read its contents. I understood only that it concerned the girl's parentage, and that Honoria wished her to know the truth, the whole truth, I believe, of what had happened to her mother, and why. 2 years ago," Miss Marple repeated, half to herself, and felt the last, cold certainty of the pattern close finally around her. 2 years! The span of time, she now understood, in which Dorothy Pargeter, quiet and unremarkable, had first learned who she truly was, and had chosen not to confront the village with her discovery, nor to flee it, but to come and settle herself within it, to join, with patient and deliberate purpose, the very circle of women who had helped bury her mother's memory 30 years before, and to sit among them, Thursday after Thursday, watching and waiting and knitting, while she gathered whatever proof or patience she required for whatever reckoning she had, in the quiet of her own grief, already resolved upon. "She never knew Honoria sent it," Miss Marple said slowly. "She could not have known, and Honoria, God rest her, believed she had done a kindness, had given the girl, at last, the truth she was owed, and perhaps hoped, in her own way, for some manner of forgiveness, or at least of understanding, to follow from it." "I believe she did hope that," Mr. Colby said heavily. "She told me, that last time we spoke of it, that she meant to go further still, to speak the truth aloud, publicly, before the whole village if need be, and let the consequences fall where they would, rather than carry the weight of it silently to her grave, as she had carried it these 30 years. She said she owed that much, at the least, to Ivy's memory, whatever it cost her own name in the telling." He looked at Miss Marple, and in his face was the dawning, horrified understanding of a man only now grasping the full weight of what his small, discreet kindness had set in motion. "She meant to tell you, Miss Marple. That is what she said to me, the very day before she died, that she meant to tell you the whole of it, the next morning, because she trusted you to hear it fairly, and because she had grown too old and too tired to carry it alone any longer." The room was very quiet. Somewhere beyond the window a bird called once, twice, and fell silent, and Miss Marple sat with her hands folded in her lap, feeling the full, terrible shape of the pattern settle at last into place. Honoria, in the last weeks of her life, moving at last toward confession, toward the public reckoning she believed Ivy's memory deserved. And Dorothy, 2 years in possession of the truth, watching that confession draw nearer with every passing Thursday, understanding, perhaps better than Honoria herself, that a confession offered freely, in old age, before a sympathetic village, would be received not as the crime it was, but as the tragic, forgivable frailty of a repentant old woman, absolved, in death or in dying, of the very guilt Dorothy had spent 2 patient years gathering the strength to see punished, in full. "She is sitting among them still," Miss Marple said quietly, more to herself than to the vicar. "Every Thursday, in that same circle, with those same women and not one of them knows what she carries, nor what she has already done to keep it hidden. She rose, drawing her coat about her with sudden, decisive purpose, the tiredness of her sleepless night falling away before something colder and more urgent. "Mr. Colby, what day is it today?" "Wednesday," he said, and watched her face change as she heard it, understanding, a moment before she spoke again, precisely what that answer meant. "Then the circle meets tomorrow," Miss Marple said, "as it has met every Thursday for 11 years, and I think, Mr. Colby, that I had better be there when it does." Chapter 10. The Last Stitch. Thursday arrived grey and still, the kind of soft autumn day when the light seems reluctant to fully commit itself, and little Wickham went about its ordinary business beneath a sky the colour of unspun wool, entirely unaware that anything of consequence was to occur within it. Miss Marple spent the morning in quiet preparation of a kind that involved no packing, no instruments, no summoning of constables, only a long, careful review, undertaken alone in her room with a cup of tea gone cold at her elbow, of every thread she had gathered these past weeks, laid out in her mind as methodically as a pattern chart, until she was satisfied that the design, however sorrowful, was complete and correct in every row. The circle met that afternoon at Mrs. Fenwick's house. The 5 remaining women gathered in the small, chintz-cushioned parlour with the particular subdued determination of people continuing a ritual less from pleasure now than from the fear of what its ending might mean. And Miss Marple, arriving a little after the appointed hour with her own work-bag in hand, was welcomed with the easy, unsuspecting warmth the village had extended to her from her very first visit. She took the chair nearest the fire, drew out a piece of plain grey knitting she had begun that morning for the express purpose of having something to occupy her hands, and allowed the conversation to move for a while through its accustomed channels. The weather, the bazaar, a mild disagreement over a pattern's gauge, while she waited, with the patience of a woman who had waited a very long time for far less important truths, for the moment to present itself. It was Mrs. Prentice in the end who gave it to her, remarking, in the course of some idle comment about the changing season, that it scarcely seemed possible Honoria had been gone above a month already, and how strange the room felt still without her in it. "It is strange," Miss Marple agreed gently, setting down her needles, "how a room remembers a person rather longer than we sometimes wish it to. I have been thinking a great deal this past month about Honoria, and about this room, and about how very long some things may be kept within a room's walls before they finally find their way out into the light." She looked up and found 5 pairs of eyes upon her, 5 faces arranging themselves with varying success into expressions of polite attention. "I wonder whether I might tell you all a story. It concerns a young woman who died on these very stairs very long ago, and a child she left behind her, and a scarf that was unpicked and rewoven by a hand very much more patient than mine." The silence that followed was not the brief, startled silence of surprise. It was longer, heavier, the silence of a room in which several people, all at once, understood that a reckoning, long postponed, had finally, irrevocably, arrived. Miss Marple told it plainly, and without cruelty, though without softening either. The parlour-maid, Ivy Cotter, dead upon these stairs 30 years before, under a verdict of misadventure that owed rather more to the family's standing than to the truth of the matter. The sister sent quietly north within the fortnight. The child born some months earlier and given away under another name to a family who never knew what history they had unknowingly taken in, and Honoria herself, carrying the weight of that old silence for 30 years, until age and conscience together had driven her, in these last months of her life, toward a confession she had not lived to make. She spoke of the sewing box, locked with a key that had vanished, of the scarf within it, unravelled and rewoven by someone who had known enough of Honoria's habits to enter that cottage unremarked, of the photograph with its careful, deliberate excision, and the small pale ribbon that had survived it, and of a cup, cracked along its handle, that had disappeared from a kitchen on the very night its owner died, and had not been seen since. She did not, for a long while, name anyone at all. She let the room supply its own names, watching, as she spoke, the faces around her, Mrs. Fenwick's growing pale with genuine shock, Miss Thorne's rigid with the particular horror of a woman realizing how near she had sat, for months, to something she had never suspected, Mrs. Prentice's crumpling, at last, into open, silent tears, the tears of a woman who had spent 30 years telling herself a small, comfortable lie, and was only now discovering what that lie had truly cost. And Dorothy Pargeter sat very still throughout, her hands folded in her lap over the half-finished piece of knitting she had set down when Miss Marple began to speak, her face composed into an expression of careful, listening attention that gave away nothing at all, until Miss Marple, gently, without raising her voice, without any change at all in her mild and unhurried manner, turned at last to look directly at her, and said, "You knew all of this before I did, Dorothy. You have known it, I think, for very nearly 2 years. Honoria wrote to you herself, though she took great care that you should never know it was her hand behind the letter. She believed, I think, that she was giving you a gift, however painful, the gift of your own true history, restored to you at last. She could not have known that the gift would return to her, in the end, as a judgment." Dorothy did not move for a long moment. Then, with a composure that Miss Marple would remember for the rest of her own life as one of the most terrible things she had ever witnessed, more terrible than any outburst, any denial, any tears, she reached down, picked up her knitting from her lap, and resumed, quite calmly, the row she had left unfinished, her needles moving with the same neat, disciplined precision they had always shown, as though she required the motion to steady something within herself that words alone could not hold. "She wrote to me," Dorothy said, her voice low and even, "and told me my mother's name, and how she died, and why. She told me I had a right to know, after 30 years of not knowing, and she was right. I did have that right, and I am grateful, in whatever way a person can be grateful for such a thing, that I finally received it." Her needles clicked on, steady, unbroken. "But she did not tell me she meant to confess it. Not then. I learned that only these last months, from things half overheard in this very room. Honoria, growing restless, growing sorrowful, speaking of setting things right before the end, of things kept too long in drawers. And I understood, listening to her, that she meant to stand up one day, before all of you, before the vicar, before God knows who else, and say what she had done, and that you would all forgive her for it. You would weep for her, and call it a tragedy of her youth, and remember her afterward as a good woman who had made one grave mistake and repented of it at the last. Her hands stilled, at last, upon the needles, though she did not look up. My mother was 19 years old. She had a child, and no husband, and a family too grand to let either inconvenience stand in the way of its own comfort. And she died on these stairs, and no one ever said her name above a whisper for 30 years. And Honoria was going to be forgiven for it. She was going to be loved for it, in the telling, the poor, brave, honest old woman, unburdening herself at last. I could not let that happen. I would not let my mother become, at the very end, only the means by which Honoria Blackiston earned herself a peaceful death and a kind memory. "And so you went to her," Miss Marple said quietly, "that Thursday evening, after the others had gone." "I went to speak with her," Dorothy said, and for the first time something in her voice wavered, some crack appearing at last in the long, careful composure. "Only to speak with her. I meant only to tell her I knew, to see her face when she understood that the daughter she had so kindly, so generously informed of her own tragedy was standing before her, and had been standing beside her every Thursday for months, knitting in this very room, saying nothing. I wanted her to feel, just once, what it was to have something sprung upon her that she had not chosen and could not control." She stopped. Her hands, still holding the needles, had begun, almost imperceptibly, to tremble. She was not afraid. That was the thing I had not expected. She looked at me when I told her, and she did not flinch, and she did not deny it, and she said she was glad. She said she had hoped, all along, that I would come to her myself, that it would spare her the telling, and that now perhaps we might go together, the next day, and tell it properly, before everyone, and let whatever came of it come. Her voice had dropped almost to a whisper now, and the room around her had gone utterly, breathlessly still. She was going to be forgiven anyway. Even confessing to me, in that moment she was already being forgiven. I could hear it in her voice, the relief of it, the lightness, as though the telling itself were the whole of the punishment, and the punishment nearly done with. And I thought of my mother, 19 years old, falling on those very stairs, with no one in the whole world to grieve her properly, no one to say her name, and I thought, she does not get to be lightened of this. She does not get to feel better for having finally said it aloud. She did not describe the moment itself. She did not need to. The room understood, in the silence that followed, exactly what had happened on those stairs, in the dark, between one breath and the next. An old woman turning, perhaps, to lead the way back down toward the kitchen, toward the tea she meant to make to steady them both before the difficult days ahead. And a younger woman behind her, 30 years of unspoken grief gathered into a single instant of contact, a single decisive motion, over almost before it had begun. "I unpicked the row in her scarf," Dorothy said, so quietly now that Miss Marple had to lean forward to catch it, because I had helped her knit it weeks before, sitting beside her one evening when the others had gone early, and I did not want anything of mine left behind in that house for anyone to find and wonder at. I took the cup because it was mine. She had given it to me herself, that last hour, poured me tea in it with her own hands, called it a peace offering, and I could not bear the thought of the police finding it and asking why an old woman's favourite cup should have been used to pour tea for a guest on the very night she died. I took the key because the box held the ribbon I had pinned inside it years before. My mother's ribbon, the only thing of hers I have ever possessed, which Honoria herself had kept all these years, and had given back to me with the letter, and I had left it, foolishly, sentimentally, in her sewing box one evening, meaning to collect it, and never had the chance until it was too late to matter in any way but this one. She looked up, at last, and found Miss Marple's eyes upon her. Not with condemnation, though condemnation would not have been unjust, but with something gentler and infinitely sadder, the look of a woman who had spent her whole long life observing human weakness, and had never yet found cruelty in the observing of it. Would she have forgiven me? Dorothy asked. And it was, Miss Marple understood, the only question that had truly mattered to her from the very beginning. Not whether she would be caught, not whether she would be punished, but this, alone, asked now, in a voice stripped entirely of its long composure. My mother, if she had lived to see what I have done in her name, would she have forgiven me for it? Miss Marple was quiet a long moment, turning the question over with the same careful gentleness she brought to everything that truly mattered. I cannot tell you that, my dear, she said at last. No one can tell you that, and I think you have known all along that no one could. I think that is rather why you have carried this alone for 2 years, because there was no one left who could answer it for you, and you did not trust yourself to answer it alone. She reached across and, with a tenderness that surprised even herself, laid her hand briefly over Dorothy's still trembling ones. But I can tell you this. Your mother deserved, 30 years ago, to have her name spoken honestly, and her death mourned properly, and her memory treated as something more than an inconvenience to be tidied away. She did not receive that. And I am very much afraid, my dear, that in your grief for her, you have done to Honoria precisely what was once done to your mother. You have made her death, too, a thing to be quietly explained away, misadventure, an old woman's fall, so that the truth of what happened to her might be as thoroughly buried as the truth of what happened to Ivy Cotter. Her hand tightened, gently, over Dorothy's. 2 wrongs, side by side now, 30 years apart, and neither one of them made lighter by the other's weight. I think, in your heart, you have known that too this past month, watching me ask my questions and answering none of them yourself. I think that is why you left your note, and why you have knitted so tightly these past weeks that half your rows have wanted unpicking. Dorothy did not weep. She sat very still, her hand beneath Miss Marple's, and something in her face, the long watchfulness, the careful composure maintained so completely for so many months, seemed at last to loosen, not into grief exactly, but into something quieter and more exhausted, the stillness of a person finally permitted to set down a weight they had carried so long they had forgotten what it was to walk without it. I should like, she said, after a while, in a voice gone very small, to tell them properly, my mother's name. I should like it said, once, in this village, by someone who means it kindly. It was Mr. Colby who came, within the hour, summoned quietly by Mrs. Fenwick's shaken young son, and it was Mr. Colby who sat with Dorothy in that parlour, gentle and grave, until the constable arrived from the county town, and Dorothy went with him, in the end, without resistance, without protest, with something almost like relief in the set of her shoulders, as a woman goes at last to lay down a burden she has carried too far and too long, alone. The village did not know, for some while, quite what to do with itself in the aftermath. There was shock, of course, and a great deal of talk, and the particular uneasy silence of a community forced to look, at last, at a history it had spent 30 years agreeing not to see. The circle did not meet again, not out of any formal decision, but simply because no one, when the following Thursday came, could quite bring themselves to sit again in that room, in that arrangement of chairs, with the ghost of both women now settled permanently among the empty places. Miss Marple stayed on a little longer than she had planned, tending to small, quiet matters that seemed to fall naturally to her. A word with the solicitor, a word with the vicar, a visit to old Josiah Fenn to tell him, gently, that Ivy Cotter's name would at last be spoken properly. In the churchyard, upon a small stone Mr. Colby had already begun arranging to have placed, 30 years late, but placed nonetheless. And on her final evening in Little Wickham, sitting alone by the fire in her borrowed room, Miss Marple took up Honoria's old scarf, still unfinished, still wrapped in its yellowed tissue where it had lain since the sewing box was first opened, and worked the last dozen rows herself, by lamplight, her own needles moving with the easy, unhurried competence of 60 years' practice, casting off. At last, the final stitch of a pattern begun by one dead woman and completed by another entirely unconnected to her, in an act that was neither justice nor forgiveness, but something quieter than either. A small, private acknowledgement that some things, once begun, deserve at least to be finished properly, even if the hand that began them cannot be the hand that sees them through. She sent the scarf, unsigned, to the church bazaar the following week, where it was bought, she later learned, by a stranger passing through, who admired its fine grey-blue wool and had no notion at all of the long, sorrowful history knitted into its rows, the truth withheld and the truth demanded, the silence kept and the silence broken, a mother unmourned and a daughter unforgiven, or perhaps, in some quiet way known only to the dead, forgiven after all. Miss Marple thought of this, from time to time, in the years that followed, of villages and their long, careful silences, and the debts those silences leave behind them, gathering interest in the dark until someone, sooner or later, comes to collect. She had learned, over a long life spent watching such things unfold in rooms not unlike that firelit parlour, that truth deferred is never truth avoided, only truth postponed, and that the postponing costs, in the end, a great deal more than the telling ever would have. It was not a comfortable lesson. But then, she reflected, gathering her own knitting and turning at last toward home, the comfortable lessons were rarely the ones worth learning, and it was, perhaps, the particular sad duty of old women who noticed such things to go on learning them anyway, one small, careful stitch at a time.